welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duval, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who's hightailing his mercenary hide back to the landing pad.
Tim Longo.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah. Oh, man. Not my favorite part of the game, of the levels. Dark Forces, which we are still talking about.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. There was at least a couple of times while I was streaming this last week where I said, I think Tim and I are going to talk about this part.
Yeah.
And the first of those is actually is it the Kell dragon? I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's Kell dragon, but I feel like that's a crate dragon. No, crate dragons are bigger. I think that is, I don't know. I feel like that might be a Star Wars mistake, but I'd have to look it up. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. There's a crate dragon, which is like Krayt, right? That is spelled differently.
Yeah, but I think that's actually much bigger.
That's what it's supposed to be.
I don't know. I can't imagine they made that mistake. So they must both exist. But the Kell dragon threw me off.
Kell dragon. Okay.
Yeah, it was a funny way to open that level. I don't know. It's always fun to kind of obviously mix it up on the player, and this is the sort of Metroid, right? Take your stuff away. We're talking about Jabba's palace, Jabba's ship, rather. And apologize if you hear screaming children outside my window. I can't control it. Some strangers are down there having some sort of screaming match, and so if you hear it on the cast, I apologize. There's nothing I can do. But anyway,
yeah, no. Apparently they were originally supposed to be crate dragons, but crate dragons were then determined to be much bigger in the canon, and so they had to sort of back off on that and call it something else. And they made that up. Yeah, so that's they adjusted it to, and so there was probably something where that hadn't been sort of determined yet, hadn't been figured out in canon. What is this crate dragon? How big is it? I certainly don't know because it's all that. But I did sort of dig out what's the Kell dragon compared to a crate dragon.
Well, crate dragon bones are found in lots of.
Oh, those are the enormous bones that are on Tatooine.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that actually shows up in the new trilogy, The Force Awakens. At least there's some giant dragon bones, I guess, that's what.
That might be it. Yeah,
but let's set that aside because I'm not happy with all my stuff has been taken away. My only point of reference in the films for I kill something bigger than me is I drop a door on it.
Oh, right. I didn't even think of that because I knew what I needed to do. And it turns
out that what I have to do is actually just punch it, which was not like that's not a good plan.
I see. So you weren't sure what to do. You were.
You can actually watch if you go and watch my stream. You can see me running around and like I crouch in places. Like maybe there's a place I can crawl through. I hit space along the wall or whatever. I hit engage along the wall everywhere, trying to find the spot where clearly there's a trick here I'm not getting. Mm-hmm. And then I die several times, and I finally say to the chat, "What am I supposed to do here?" And I think I actually even look it up on the web, like, "What am I supposed to be doing here?" And oh no, you punch it to death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. I mean, I had no trouble because I knew what to do, but I guess when there was no teaching of that. There was no, other than you didn't have weapons and you have your fist out.
Right, your fists are equipped.
There's not much of a clue there about what to do, and it doesn't make sort of logical sense that you would need to punch the thing. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really just was relying on. I mean, the thing is that it connects so well with Jabba, and so especially Return of the Jedi that my expectation is definitely as a player that, this is the moment in Jedi where Luke drops the door on the thing. Let me just figure out how to do that. That's cool. Mm-hmm. And I almost wonder if it was designed that way, and then the tech to have a dropping grate that made sense, or the collision to make that work, or paying it off. And so, I mean, just like a million things that would have been very difficult maybe to do at the time just didn't pay off. And they didn't have time to do the tech. But decided to keep the dragon anyway. So,
yeah, it'd be interesting. Well, and then you meet the dragon at least once more, right? Or
you do one more time in that level. That's it.
Yeah, and it's a funny, it's an interesting point I hadn't anticipated talking about, to be honest, because we talked about this a little bit last time, but and not to jump ahead to one of my pillars, but they try to lean into fantasy fulfillment, Star Wars fantasy fulfillment, quite so heavily in this game. And we talked about this with TIE Fighter as well, but this game goes even further.
Yeah, even way more so. Yeah, absolutely.
And to the degree where the cinematic that plays at the beginning of this level, I don't know if you caught it, but after Jabba's hologram goes away and they push Kyle into the pit, the animation, the 2D animation and artwork that when they sort of show that animated moment when they shove him, it looks just like Han getting basically carbonated, I guess, or maybe shoved in. Like it really. Oh,
when he's lowered into the
and he says, I love you, I know, and then he gets zapped and his head goes back, and I'm probably way overthinking this, but because we know John Knowles is the one that did the 2D art for this game, I can totally, because he's such an enormous Star Wars geek, I can totally see him just like emulating that. And it just really smacked of Han Solo, in like a very direct way. And it makes it, even though that didn't happen on Jabba's palace in the movie, it just felt like it. And to your point, like you're down there now and you're like, okay, well, I'm in a movie, quote unquote. And so they're kind of, what would they do? And so it's kind of this interesting, unintentional red herring based on trying to be so movie-like that you start solving puzzles based on things you know about the movie. It's funny too that, I think I got flack for this ultimately, and it wasn't the age of the internet where you could get direct flack, but the last level, spoiler for Mysteries of the Sith, which was my first project as a level designer. The last level was one of my levels, and the puzzle for the very end of the game, where you are basically fighting Kyle as Mara Jade, was
wow, God, it's been a long time.
Do you remember the solution to the very last thing you do?
I remember the solution to JK, actually. Well, there's two solutions to JK. One is if you're dark side, I think you can fight, but if you're light side, you can put the lightsaber away, or am I thinking of Mysteries of the Sith?
No, that's Mysteries of the Sith. Yeah, no. It's
okay.
There is no, there's not two endings, but basically you're fighting Kyle and he's indestructible. And so you just fight him endlessly until you choose, because you're there to kind of save him from going to the dark side. And so until you show mercy, and the reason I bring that up, the solution was to basically stop fighting, and show that you yourself are not turning to anger. So the reason I bring that up is nobody got it, because that's not something that you would think to do. I guess Luke does it, I guess there's an argument I'm thinking of now that Luke does it in Jedi, and maybe that's where I originally got it. But it's just, it's just putting those clues in there. You can't, it's like these weird red herrings where you got to kind of think about it from a fan's perspective of what would they do.
Right. It almost becomes, it's funny because at those moments, I mean, this is one of the things that's weird, is that it's one of those things that in an action game can be a real role-playing moment that is almost never present in a role-playing game. You know what I mean? Because you're trying to literally put yourself into the role of the Kyle Katarn character or the Mara Jade character, and of course Kyle standing in for Han Solo, or in this case Luke. you're literally trying to think. I mean, I was literally thinking, well, what would this hero do? Let me play the role of this hero in the movies. Whereas in a role-playing game, because there's usually such flexibility around the decisions you'll make, the fact that you choose one thing or another is not you playing a role. It's just sort of making a systemic decision, really often. Mm-hmm. It might be in the terms that you've sort of defined for yourself for your character, but often as not, it's more just, oh, this is what I think to do, and I do that thing. Which is funny, because when you actually have a specific character, there's a way in which you are more inhabiting a role. It's just a weird terminology thing.
Well, I think in this case, you actually want, because this game is about trying to fully realize Star Wars in a first-person shooter for the first time, I think you want that to be the case.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You fall down there, and you're like, oh,
nobody would describe it as a role-playing game.
No. But
that's what I mean. We often describe our genres more about what some series of things that we associate with them. So role-playing games, it's numbers and systems and choices about your characters and things like that. But really, it's not about the action that you're doing. It's more about some sort of systems that are in the game. And action adventure games are actually the things where you're more taking a specific role, which is, I don't know, I just kind of never thought about it that way. But it's more like, it's just a weird way to describe the genres that we have. And I know that comes from the pen and paper. I mean, I totally understand it. It's not a super weird thing. It's just, in that moment, I made decisions based on the role I thought I was playing. And I just thought, oh, that's what role playing is. I mean, I don't know, it's a weird thing.
Yeah. It's a funny combo. It's the role that is handed to you versus the role you're creating.
Right.
I feel like, I don't remember what game we would have talked about this.
Final Fantasy IX.
Oh yeah, I think you're right.
Because all the characters are defined. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was playing Witcher at the time, I believe. And, technically still am.
Jeez.
But I've paused it for Zelda. But the point being that I probably brought up at the time is, an Elder Scrolls or even a Baldur's Gate style game versus Witcher, where you're playing a defined character, and so you definitely are role playing in both. But one of the reasons I like The Witcher is I like role playing as Geralt and kind of playing along with what the fantasy of being him and being a Witcher is, versus in, say, a Baldur's Gate, I'm picking any class that I want, and I'm the sort of like the chosen one.
You mean you're picking a ranger, right?
Okay, yes, okay. I mean the proverbial eye.
In theory, right? In theory, you're picking any class, but in actuality,
I'm choosing a ranger, and you're choosing a bard, and you have a hamster on your shoulder, or whatever.
I was going to say, you can make it to the end, and I can't. It's fine. It's a whole thing.
But it's just it's an interesting point. Yeah, that there's sort of two different forks in the road when it comes to that, and then you apply this to a game like this, where there's an extra layer of fantasy fulfillment because of the franchise, and it's like, how far down that, and then the other weird meta layer that we wouldn't have known and the player wouldn't have known at the time is that this, as we talked about in the first episode, this was originally going to be a Luke Skywalker game, apparently.
Oh, right.
Which is even more hilarious, because then your decision.
You're literally replaying things from.
You would think, you're like, well, I should do this or this. Yeah, how funny. Yeah. And
although at that point you would expect that Luke would have had some force powers or something and could have done something else with that.
Yeah, that's why this wouldn't have. I mean, maybe that's why the sequel ended up being about Jedi or something. But yeah, this would have been a whole different game, I think, if it would have been Luke.
Yeah.
At
the very least, he wouldn't have been this sort of ruffian, sort of smuggler type, or whatever. I mean, there would have been a lot of massaging of the story to even make it work. And then why wouldn't he fly himself? I mean, there's a lot of things that are very different when it becomes Luke. So it's really interesting.
They clearly chose the Han archetype once they went away from that, because all of the dialogue, the decision making, I would even say the mission objectives and the way that they structure the game is very much things that Han would do. I
almost want to say that they chose to move away from Luke because Rebel Assault, I think, had more Luke stuff, right?
Oh yeah, perhaps. Yeah, there was,
and maybe they didn't want to cannibalize that and things like that. It's an interesting sort of, why this versus that? I mean, I don't think we're going to play a Rebel Assault game ever, but It is definitely interesting.
Maybe we can ask some of these questions.
Yeah, that's true. Good.
Perhaps. Yeah. The funny thing about the rest of this level, I feel like other than the opening, it kind of was a forgettable. I didn't really like the level as much as a lot of the other ones. There wasn't really, other than the beginning, there wasn't really a lot of definition to what, other than the texture set, there wasn't really a lot of definition to what it was all about.
Right. I was immediately going to say, well, it does kind of look more like a pleasure craft or whatever.
Yeah, and that was kind of cool and nice, and a nice fresh change. But I feel like regardless of the location and the visual aesthetic of each of the levels, most of them have also had some sort of identity when it comes to level design or puzzle design or something like that, right? Where it's like, for instance, the sewer level, with all of the flowing sewage and the different enemies and sort of the different channels and blocks that you had to open and stuff. So I'm trying to think, like the Ramses.
I mean, here it was really just an enemy set change, right? It was more all the bounty hunter types. It was the Gamorrean guards. It was the I already forgot the name of them. The eye stalk guys.
Gran, maybe. Yeah,
I think Grans, and it was the one with the concussion rifle. It was those three.
Yeah, that's a Trandoshan. Come on.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. Trandoshan.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Those are the bad guys in Republic Commando, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Bosk from Empire. Right?
I know. I'm a bad lead programmer. I get
No, well, but all of those, we had seen all of those before. There were no new enemies.
There was nothing new. Yeah. No, that's the dragon. Although the dragon was kind of a big thing, and again, I think that if they had paid off on that with a set piece, it would have been fun. It would have been great, and I would have thought, oh man, that's amazing, and it would have been really an early example of a set piece. I mean, I think it's also an interesting decision, right? Of course, when you do these sorts of things late in a game, then sometimes those things are just like, those are the easy things to cut. Right, to pull back on, because, well, who's going to get that far? Well, there'll be fewer people who get that far, right? I mean, it just it's
but in the fantasy
thing, especially at the time,
some Jabba centric thing, you know what I mean, is such I mean, regardless, it's fine to have it in there. I just forgot that the level design itself wasn't that memorable to me. I just kind of blow through it and. While the others, I mean, the next level is the Imperial City, which so many cool things to talk about there, I think. Let's move on to that then. Yeah. I mean, for a Star Wars geek, like being just even at this location, which is something we really hadn't seen before in any of the films, and
right, only very briefly at the end of Jedi, right?
Yeah, and you get a sense of it, but it's very brief, right? And you don't really get a sense of what it's like to walk around.
Less than a second, probably 2 seconds, maybe.
Yeah, and this is just a great crescendo level in many ways. So, but one of the coolest. So there's a lot to talk about in this level for me, but. One of the, just being in the enemy territory, right, and having this concept of, because there's a lot of enemies in this level. You open up some of those doors into kind of those big kind of courtyard areas, and they're just like dudes everywhere, and then this sense of going deeper and deeper into it. Is this the one? Isn't there also a Dark Trooper?
There is a Dark Trooper here.
Yeah, phase 1 in one of the outer areas.
Phase 1. There's definitely phase 1. I can't remember if there's a phase 2, but there's also that crazy. There's a puzzle that seems almost derived from the detention center. I feel like there's a graphic in one of the movies where with the hexagon or octagon or whatever.
That's what I wanted to get to. Yeah, that's just infamous kind of a level design puzzle,
spatial puzzle, sure.
Spatial puzzle, yeah. I just love it. It's a little weird. Like the logic isn't quite there, but you just get this sense of once you're they've built up some sort of weird defenses to protect this thing, and it's like it's like the detention center, a little bit like the getting to the tractor beam controls in a way, right? Because you get into the middle of it and you're like pulling all the levers and stuff. But just like the interaction of the doors, and just kind of, again, I can't think of an example. There probably is one that we can't cite Dark Forces with being the innovator here, but for the other shooters of the time, I just don't remember spatial level design puzzles like this that were as elaborate as this kind of thing. And
absolutely,
it blew my mind, and again,
and yet, I mean, the thing is, at the same time, it can't even fully support it, because there's a texture on the wall which shows basically the layout of the whole thing, this big like hexagon thing. And if you open and close the locks, that thing doesn't change.
Sure.
Which it should, right? So I was like trying to work it out. There was a point I went back and watched my stream tonight. I was like, was it really helpful to be able to go and watch the stream and be like, what did I want to talk to Tim about? And I got to this point and I looked at the wall and I went and changed something. I looked back at the wall and I'm like, oh man, it doesn't change. I really wanted it to, because it was, where am I? So it's so close, but it's enough still to basically put you in that space and think, okay, let me think about this. Where am I? Okay, I'm here. I've got to be here, right? Okay, so I should be able to go two counterclockwise and start opening them all the way, and they go two more, and then close those just one. And I mean, you just kind of like build up this. Oh, okay. I see how I would get to the next level. It was a really interesting sort of unpeeling of that onion of when you first go in, you kind of go around the circle until you're opening things and you get to a point where you're like, oh, I can go in here.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, what's that about? But now I can't go anywhere. And so you come back out and you're like, that's strange. Well, let me keep doing this thing I'm doing. And then it slowly dawns on you like, oh, I'm moving like these pieces that are part of this thing. Oh, it's really nice. It isn't fully supported.
Sure. Well, that's
by the tech, but there's a mental map that you sort of build up of like, oh, right, that makes sense. There's definitely kind of logic to it.
That's why I put it in the innovation bucket, because they're stretching what actually is possible. You know what I mean? They're like, and how do I put this? Like the thing that I'm so excited about talking about this is because even though I didn't work on this game, I was close enough to the people that worked on it, and also, got to work on some of the legacy of this with Mysteries of the Sith and Indian stuff in similar engines, and talking to those same level designers, and even talking to, both Matt and Tadishi, who we talked about, Inger some, Schmitty, and then Reed too, because Reed Knight, who we've had on the podcast in his QA capacity, he moved over to level design, and he was a level designer on the sequel to this game, Jedi Knight. And again, I guess Duke 3D did a little bit of this, but I'm just trying to think of this era, the games that actually really embellished upon level design puzzle making like this. And so much of the design mentality and aesthetics and kind of like pillars of just the design department at LucasArts for the shooters at least was about this. How do you make the level into an interesting, Rubik's Cube kind of mentality? Steve Chen was another person that they hired from architecture, and just these level designers who were thinking differently than just about combat, and stretching, like doing things that were unnatural with the engine and with scripting, and specifically with scripting. Like this level is a really good example of like, okay, they're taking, again, probably making an unintended use of how to actually build a level in this game and making this puzzle out of it. Well, hopefully we should find out who. Well,
almost certainly those sliding pieces were elevators.
Yeah, exactly. It's using pieces that you have in very unexpected ways and making the most out of it. And like you said, not fully supported, but that sort of like pushing the boundaries is exactly where innovation comes from, where it's like, well, what if I did this,
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's an excellent case, and we definitely saw this both in both the Starfighter games, and in particular in JSF with the level where it was a tug of war or something. It was 4 tugs of war that were going on. It was one of John.
John Drake.
John Drake's. Yeah, it was one of John Drake's levels where there was this tug of war. You were scavenging parts, but there were these scavenger tugs that would come out, and if you couldn't get the thing back, it would pull them, and you sort of had this constant sort of battle to get these 4 pieces of this big gun, because in Star Wars it's always about some big gun that you're going to mount on a planet or whatever, to get those together so that you could do a thing with it, rather than the Trade Federation, I guess. And those were the times as a programmer where I thought, oh, you know what? I don't need to give these people more. I don't need to solve all their problems. I need to give them pieces that they can fit together in interesting ways.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was a real, I mean, it was a revelation for me, because I didn't even get that you could do things like that with what I had already given them, especially for Jedi Starfighter. But even on Starfighter, and certainly on this game, I know they didn't have a lot with the scripting language. They didn't have variables. They maintained state with elevators that you couldn't see. I mean, I know there were a lot of weird things that they would do, like, oh, you've picked up the such and such. The elevator is at this level, and now it runs some script that just does a thing, unlocks a door or whatever. They had all sorts of weird tricks that the designers would do, and we can hopefully talk to a guest about that. But it is really interesting. You give creative people some tools and some constraints, and they'll just make magic. It's just how it works, and it's kind of wonderful.
And it's in an era that we talked. I think we talked about this in one of the previous episodes. It's in an era when they didn't really know any better, right? Like, it's like there wasn't anybody. The medium has matured to a degree where there's a lot of examples of how to do things one way or the other. And there's obviously many games in the world at this point. But, in the early days, like especially in a 3D shooter space, there was Doom, and there, Wolfenstein and the id games primarily. And then Epic was kind of getting out there. But even just what scripting means to a shooter, Half-Life innovated, Unreal 1 innovated specifically, and even Quake, didn't only went so far with some of this stuff. Like scripting was like opening doors and spawning monsters and stuff, but like having a moment where you're not fighting for quite a while and just trying to figure out how to navigate this hexagon, that was pretty unheard of. And so they didn't know. They're just like, well, what if we did this? Let's just do it and try it. And there was no one saying, no, that's not how you do it, or that's not right for this genre or whatever,
Right.
And I just remember just great deep design debates and discussions and stuff just about like, how do you push things, and people using scripting that, like you said, was really not meant to do some of the things in really creative, just inspired ways that nobody saw. And I would say in the design department at LucasArts at the time, it also was sort of a bit of a healthy competition between level designers of like, what crazy stuff can I do? And we're pitching to each other. You're like, oh, what if we did this? And honey, you can't do that. That's impossible. No, I'm going to do it.
Right.
And just kind of trying to one up each other in kind of in a healthy way. And I don't know, it was a really interesting. Yeah, it was a really interesting. Design is sort of mentality there at the time that I think that the Dark Forces really started when it comes to the shooters of the company. But
yeah, no, that's a fair point. And turning again to Starfighter, I remember having conversations, especially with Jedi Starfighter, of trying to sort of restrict the risk that we were going to have, because it was a game that we needed to do in under a year, basically, because it was effectively an expansion pack. So we're going to do a lot of level stuff, a bunch of levels, and not a ton of new tech, although we ended up doing quite a bit. But looking at each level as proposed by designers and saying, well, can you massage it this way to sort of limit if we can't support you on this thing or that thing, that you'll at least be able to get it done. And it can still fill the role that it needs to fill in the game. We may just need to change some essential aspect of it. Some of those technical things were not a big deal, and some of them we couldn't surmount. Literally, we just, and I'm thinking of, in particular, there was one called Mount Marican, where originally it was supposed to be a mountain that was so high you couldn't see the ground. It was like cloud cover below, and we just couldn't make that work. It just never made any sense. So we were like, well, what about a smaller mountain? Would that be okay? Whereas there was another one which was on a planetoid, and all of the gameplay ended up being created on the side of the planet that was effectively in the XY plane, I guess, or XZ plane. I can't remember what the coordinate system was in that game, but in such a way that was on the side of the planet where gravity would have made sense anyway, in case we couldn't make the gravity zero in on the center of the planet for everything, the flight models and the bombs and all that stuff. And so we kind of, but I point that out only to say that that we were kind of coming along at a time when we were slowly shifting towards the production realities that we essentially live in today. Like we've switched all the way over from where we were before, which is, we'll try this crazy thing and I'll make it work, to, hey, we'll try to do it this way so that if it doesn't work, we can at least salvage it, to like total production over control to a certain degree. In the sort of AAA space, obviously.
Yeah, because I think, at this point, pivoting on something, if you go in a certain direction because it doesn't work, is so costly, so it's like the aversion to risk is really high. I think in that regard, and also why you want to build tools and pipelines and workflows that allow you to pivot more quickly. And if you don't have that, then like you said, like with your examples of Starfighter, giving yourself constraints and kind of scoping, and also just being pivoting a little bit differently about what the idea for the level was. So it can work, and the player will never know about that. It's just enough. Right. So the core idea is still there, but yeah, it's just I don't know if it's why this game as a player spoke to me so much at the time, and why it was such a big inspiration. I'm kind of I'm having a retrospective on the fly on this, by the way, for myself, and why it was kind of a big inspiration for me getting into the industry at all, because that, I guess the word I was looking for earlier is sort of a design ethos that that LucasArts ended up inadvertently maybe having and creating, where it became a priority that the levels were more than just a place for combat, and I feel like, I don't know if I can completely give them the credit for that in the shooter space, but I feel like that started to, with Half-Life and with the LucasArts shooters, I think that started to be more of the norm over time, because the early ones were kind of...
I would extend it further out from that at LucasArts. I mean, I think it carried through to Outlaws. I think it carried through to the JK, but also to your Indiana Jones game, the Infernal Machine. Like, totally, and to a degree, I honestly think that, especially as you go later into those engines, the level design actually saves those games a lot more than the core mechanics do, or certainly the tech. For sure. And there's good reason for that. I mean, I think that at the time, technology at LucasArts anyway was not as much a driving factor. There were good engineers at LucasArts throughout, but catching up and keeping on top of that, I think it was not as well devoted to that, and it actually was distinguishing itself with design. So
it was it wasn't an id or an epic. I mean,
exactly.
There's a lot of. I mean, I don't always put too much. I don't always give too much credit to this kind of theory or mentality, but I don't know if you've ever heard this. I don't think we've ever talked about it, but sometimes you'll hear developers kind of say, they'll kind of judge a studio based on what they think the core discipline that kind of guides that studio is. Where it's like, oh yeah, that X studio that's an art driven studio. They're all about like making great art and focusing on that, and you can see that the rest of the stuff suffers, or like an id or an epic is technology driven. primarily, and that's their ethos is really built around like the whole business model and all that kind of stuff. And I do think in large parts of a LucasArts for most of its history, I would have called it a design centric studio. And I include kind of writing and and kind of like that side of things in there too, especially with the adventure games. Like art definitely was a big part of it too, but I feel like especially for the Star Wars stuff, design ended up kind of being the focus of how we were doing things. And again, I don't put much credibility into that kind of theory per se, but it is interesting.
I think it's a better lens earlier than it is later, because as time has gone on, just to be competitive, you need to compete on all of those areas. But
you do need to,
certainly at the time and from the sort of late 80s and into the 90s, I think that you could definitely see that. And I mean, talking to the Fallout people, Leonard Boyarsky and Tim
Kaine.
Tim Kaine, that was a studio that was not super tech heavy. They were very design and even to a degree art heavy, but tech was not really their strong point. And I think that was also true of Obsidian when we talked to Chris Avallone about Planescape. That was also a design and writing heavy studio. I think that was still going on well into our time at LucasArts. But I think as time has gone on, it's definitely, you need to be able to compete everywhere to compete at all in the AAA space, obviously. But
I think the indies
continuing to distinguish that.
Yeah, but then the great thing about this level is it ends with Boba Fett. So call like it comes just with a great puzzle section and great moments with a Dark Trooper and just being in a Imperial city, just surrounded by hordes of stormtroopers and such. And then you have this kind of cool moment with some cool VO from Jan and stuff about you won't believe who's out here, and then you get there. The boss fight itself was not obviously that great and pretty basic, but you are fighting Boba Fett, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that went by so quickly for me that it was hard to even identify him as Boba Fett.
Yeah,
do we basically kill him there? I mean,
yeah, it's it's quote unquote kill.
Yeah, hard to know. Yeah,
you can't. Okay. Does he really ever die?
I don't know. How does he get out?
He climbed out of that Sarlacc pit.
Did he really?
Yeah, there's a whole.
Oh, in the comics, right? Yeah. Who cares?
No, I know.
It is a weird thing, and basically by the time I even realized I was fighting Boba Fett on stream, I had killed him, and people were like, "Oh, there goes Boba Fett." I'm like, "Oh, I guess."
Yeah, no, and I'm speaking more to the idea of it than the actual implementation. Like,
right?
Once he's out there, you're like, "Oh, you don't really get a good look at him," and you can kill him pretty quickly, but
it's also at ease of difficulty. Playing on the easy level, nothing lasts long at that, So
right.
There was another actually area. I think it was in the Imperial City that I quite liked, which was an elevator that went down a bunch of different levels.
Oh yeah.
And it was sort of automated, and if you stepped off at any point, it just kept going, and then it would come back. And it was a weird section. It wasn't fully successful. It just was interesting. I'm sure there's a perfect way for that to work out that feels great, but and I didn't quite nail that. I didn't quite have the sort of perfect playthrough where it did exactly what it was expected to, because the elevator kept receding from me, and I was like, "Oh wait, where'd it go?" There's no elevator, and it would come back, and I hit the button, and etc. But
it played with your.
But I imagine on a perfect thing, it's like, oh, it goes down, and you sort of turn, and you're fighting things in multiple directions. It was definitely a neat sort of moment. And an interesting experiment, even if it didn't fully pay off. But it definitely felt like, oh, here's another weird thing. That whole section is strange that way, where there's all those corners where you can lower elevators, and I feel like I short circuited a lot of that level because I skipped a lot of that stuff and stumbled across a later intersection with the critical path.
Yeah, it was hard to parse what was actually going on in some of those sections.
Yeah, for sure. I think they're just trying to pay off on. Oh yeah, it's a big, complicated city.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah,
levels.
Yeah. So then we have the fuel station, I believe, right?
Right. You're in a fuel depot which has also got some automated thing that you're trying to hijack. Is that right? So that you can get over to the arc hammer. I guess that's how that worked.
Let's see. You're hijacking. You're hijacking a smuggler ship, right?
Right.
They're fueling up, and the smuggler rendezvous maybe with the executor or something. And then the smuggler ship is sort of aesthetically, again, another sort of fantasy fulfillment moment. The smuggler ship is sort of aesthetically, in at least the interior, looks like a Curlian Corvette kind of feel, like the Tantive 4 from The New Hope, right? The beginning where Leia is. And so you kind of have a little bit of that. But the point, this level was, I don't know, also a little forgettable. I can't really remember anything really cool that I, I guess I'm kind of looking at some of the screenshots and stuff, but one of the things that
there was a lot of big sort of open warehouse kind of areas.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's that big rotating like platform thing.
And the big rotating platform that is kind of that
was pretty cool.
A player skill puzzle of, I have to hit the button over here while it's over there so I can run and hop on an elevator and then jump to it while it's rotating. And there's even a secret in there that I didn't figure out. There are these kind of moments in occasional levels, which are, feels sort of like a thing that you might have found in A New Hope with Obi-Wan, moving around in these areas that you don't really see. You just kind of see the big moments where he's like, he disables the shield, or
they're kind of behind the scenes,
right? The behind the scenes stuff, and they're sort of imagining the glue of, he went and did a thing. We only see this part, and there's these big circles. What did he do? What are those circles? Right? There's sort of that trying to imaginatively fill in these sort of gaps, which I really appreciate. The artistry of it, of just, who knows what all this stuff does. Let's try to figure out how can we make gameplay from this thing. First of all, we don't know what it's supposed to represent or what it's supposed to do. It just looked neat on screen, right, when it was part of a film. And here they seem to try some of those things. But I do like that bit of, I tried to go and run and jump, and I messed up. I should have brought the elevator down. It was another sort of puzzle in a way, similar to the hexagon thing of trying to execute on, I need to line up this. It's just like multiple steps of, I should make sure the elevator's down so I don't have to wait for it. I should wait till the thing's already back in position before I hit the button. I mean, just like lots of little like, I messed that up. I'm going to have to try that again, et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of fun that way.
And like, like what they had to go with was, it's a fuel station, and so how do you deal? What kind of level design aesthetics can you do with that, with these big rotating things and these big, cylinders and tanks and stuff. And so you get a vague sense of that. And that particular room and puzzle was definitely pretty neat and memorable. And then, I mean, the note I wrote down for like starting with the Imperial City and then going basically till the end is, I loved, and I guess this was probably on Justin, who is the lead artist, but also he wrote the story, it sounds like, and he ended up becoming the project lead for Jedi Knight, the sequel. But the objective sort of like logic for this string of missions I really love, because there's this sense that you have a plan and you're executing. Every level is the next step of executing on that plan, right? So you have, and it's built up to this because you save Crix Medine and all this kind of stuff. So you've been building up to this, but this last string of after Jabba's ship, you get the code, and then in here you're smuggling into the ship, and then the ship becomes a stowaway into the Executor, and then in the Executor you get into the vessel that actually is moved onto the arc hammer, so there's just like you're executing on this plan that keeps working, you know what I mean? And then ultimately you get to your destination. It's just this very cool, like mercenary kind of covert thing that you're doing. And it felt really like cool to step by step work through that. And this was and then getting to a ship that was like the interior of the Corellian Corvette at the end of this mission was kind of neat too. Because you're like, oh, I'm in that ship that they, the beginning of the, it's again another fantasy fulfillment. So
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's funny. It's totally just a series of steps. It's really good story building in that way of just, oh, well, we did this, and because of that, we had to do this, and then we had to do that because we needed to do this, and then we had to do this, right? It's just like step upon step upon step. And basically, if you wrote it down as a couple of paragraphs, it's not that much.
No, it's very minimal.
There's not a lot to the story. The story is very minimal, and it's all basically told in those mission briefings. But it's a totally reasonable link, number of links in a chain, and you sort of in the moment don't really remember, oh, I need to do this. I need to find this chip, right? I mean, so you're always finding a chip or a key, or you're downloading something or uploading something. I mean, there's not a lot of sort of principal verbs there. And you do even have the setback of, oh, and then I was captured by Jabba and had to get all my stuff back. And then, but I mean, it's just sort of step by step by step as you go through that, just to tell this sort of Star Wars story. And it's pretty well done that way. I think that it has a sort of very light television feel, right? I mean, one of the things that we talked a lot about in the industry in the last 10 years is, well, maybe games should be more like television than they should be like movies. And this sort of feels like an early inkling of that, of each level is just an episode. And in this episode, we need to advance this much towards this MacGuffin so we can get to the next part of the story. Mm-hmm. It's very bare bones. It's not at all complex. And really, of course, in television, any of that stuff would be, oh, there's a million characters and they're all got their things going on and multiple arcs and all that stuff. There's a lot more complexity, but fundamentally, the structure is very similar. So I really appreciate that in this early game, really. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like an extended... Yeah, it feels more like a Star Wars TV show than it does a film, even though they're film moments, because it's such a protracted kind of set of a series of steps, and the buildup is great because it takes longer, and a lot of it's in your head because they imply it, and it's very light on the storytelling side of how they execute on the storytelling, but it's just enough to fill in the blanks. I mean, that was, it's like the 8-bit, 16-bit era too, where you fill in a lot yourself, and there's something that's great about that I'm sure that's why.
Well, and it can feel more like that television show structure because it's also leaning on 3 movies, right? So, oh, I need to do this, and of course, Darth Vader is. I mean, at the same time, he's building the Death Star, or whatever the heck he's up to, right? I mean, there's all this other stuff that's clearly going on. Clearly, all this is going on somewhere else while I'm dealing with this little problem of, I don't even know, the Dark Troopers, I guess. Because I don't know how they tie in. Like, where would they? What's their real threat? The Dark Troopers? I don't know. They're just a new weapon. So it's kind of weird that way. Like, I don't necessarily feel, especially now, sort of looking back on it, what did I really resolve? Right. I mean, I blew up the arc hammer, which is where the guy who was in charge of the project was. But clearly, they have networking, right? The plans can exist in multiple places for these Dark Troopers, right? I mean, I can't really have ended the whole thing, right? I mean, I don't know. It's a simpler era from that standpoint in storytelling.
It's a simpler time. Yeah, I mean, Star Wars has a little bit of that low-tech feel, that maybe justifies some of that stuff. You blow up a few things, though, right? I mean, I think you blow up the mines. You set charges there.
That's true. You blow up multiple things. But
blow up the robots facility as well.
Is that really the only place we can get Phrik in the galaxy? Is it really? I don't know. That seems unlikely.
Good question. The one quick thing to note on as a Star Wars geek for Mission 13 that's on the Executor, I think the Executor, I'm looking at the list, the Executor is technically the only location in the game that we have explicitly seen from the films. The Executor, I believe, is the Super Star Destroyer from Jedi. And
Yeah, I agree.
so there is a kind of a cool, like, of all the levels, this one actually literally is a place that I, as a fan would know and wonder, because you only get the glimpses of it, you wonder what it's like inside, so that was kind of cool. Just this concept that you're stowawaying on this thing. And then I think there's a battle with multiple dark troopers on this level that was pretty rough. A lot of running backwards.
Right. Well, you can sort of activate one and then pull him and deal with him, and then activate the other and pull it. That's totally kind of how it worked out for me. Yeah,
I totally messed that up. I think I activated more than one.
Yeah, I could see exactly where that would happen. Yeah.
But then, I mean, moving to the, not much more to say about the Executor. Moving to the Archammer, I do remember now, having just played it for the podcast, not my favorite level. It was kind of unfocused in some way. The conveyor belts were kind of irritating, and I don't know. It felt like a little bit more of an aimless ending from a level design perspective. At least for me, and I had forgotten about how that some of the last battles with the leader guy and those dark troopers, that was kind of a neat area, but it just was so kind of hard to grok the logic of where I was going and how I was getting there. I felt like it was just a series of complicated level design choices rather than some of the other earlier levels in the game felt more cohesive as fully realizing a sense of place and where I was based on the theme. But this one kind of like, okay, I'm in some ship, but none of it really makes sense to me.
Right. And of course there's this crazy conveyor belt puzzle.
Yeah.
Or series of obstacles, really, which is it's not well motivated. There's no sense of why this would exist whatsoever. So that's a thing. There's numerous issues with it from a player standpoint of, what am I supposed to do? Like, why would I duck under this thing, but then shoot this thing to get under this thing, but I got to run to make sure I make it time. But also then dive under here, but make sure I jump up, and then dive under and make sure I go left here, right there, left here, right there, and then jump these three things. I mean, it's a pure obstacle course. It makes a lot of the level content purely optional and really only there in case you fail, which you totally can and probably will. I failed it numerous times. And then got lost because there's a section there, once you've actually hit the button at the end of this whole conveyor belt maze, that doesn't look like a place you should be able to go. Which was ultimately my biggest frustration of, like, the first time I streamed it, I ended up losing all my lives just trying to get to the point of, where am I what's next? I combed the level, and there's a section where a conveyor belt actually never stops moving. And I ended up losing a lot of health there because it's an elevator that goes up and down. You have to jump down and you die. I mean, it's the worst. So that was another place I found really frustrating. It's maybe not the best way to cap off the game. But it's fine, I guess. I can see what they're trying to do, right? Of, let's ramp up and make something you haven't entirely seen before and all of that. And it feels complicated. It's just not great.
It was definitely ramping it up, and I felt like not only was there not a kind of a coherent logic of how you could sort of suss out, like you said, it was easy to get lost because you couldn't really figure out what you needed to do, because none of the spaces really were motivated or felt like they were, a place that I could identify and kind of figure out why the logic was there. And a lot of the other levels, I think, did a fairly okay job at that. But also, to your point about the conveyor belt, it just felt like more of a gamey level. They were just kind of making challenges from a gameplay and gaminess perspective in a kind of almost a Mario kind of way, versus, I think, some of the logic of some of the previous levels. And again, not necessarily my favorite level, but the one thing I think the sewer level does have going for it is it has a sense of place and some logic about why why the sewer system works the way that it does. At least I can make up the logic in my head. and the robotics facility had a lot of conveyor belts, but that makes sense in there because it's a
right. It's they're making things here. It's a factory, and this is this place in space, and
I don't know. Maybe they're making them on the ship, but I didn't.
But why have all these shunts off to the left and right? It's just like I don't know. Yeah. I had a hard time. Buying into it, and while I was playing, I was like, oh yeah, I remember hating this.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah.
So it's just definitely a moment of, okay. And an obstacle course is sort of, I mean, it's tough because you definitely expect player navigation skill to be at its highest when you get to the end of a game. So it actually is the place that makes the most sense to have an obstacle course. It's also not, I guess that's a thing that's kind of evolved over time. And I sort of feel like in a way you want the very end of your game actually to be a little bit easy nowadays.
Yeah. Yep. That's definitely
because you really want to you want to be in the falling action part, right? One of the things with games is that you can't really have a traditional denouement or anything like that because basically nothing's happening there and you're sort of mopping up. Because games have to sort of have rising action, and climax. But then once you've had climax, there's nothing left to do. There's no sensible stuff, right? I mean, because you've got to interact with that. And if it's less intense than what you just did, it's kind of, so I kind of understand. I kind of understand why that structure is that way. It just doesn't fit well with storytelling. So it just definitely makes it's one of those places where the two tectonic plates are rubbing up against each other, right?
Yeah. That's well put. Another funny note that I wrote down before we get into pillars or whatever. I think this game would make for a really good remake. I feel like if somebody were able to do that, and I mean a remake, not a remaster, but like
a full remake.
Yeah, like a full I didn't play it, but you told me a little bit about like the Ratchet and Clank one remake that they did.
The remake they did, the tie-in with the movie, yeah.
But it was spiritually the original game, but it was kind of a full redo, right?
Right.
I just think like a fully modernized version of this, man, it would be really really
cool. That could be really interesting. I mean,
Unreal or something,
or just take the Battlefront, Battlefront 2 tech. I mean, that Frostbite game looks amazing. Yeah. Right, the Frostbite engine, I guess. I mean, I don't know how well suited that is to making sort of straight up.
I think Unreal would be perfect for this game because
that's fair.
But there's so many cool ideas here, and I still think it holds up, to be honest. I don't think it necessarily, I'm not saying I would enjoy it more than this one, but I don't know. It just came to mind. Be a fun thing to see.
Definitely. I mean, I think that there's a lot, you'd have a much stronger sense of place. You have a very good sense of place here, but it's not.
Yeah. Oh man. Some of these spaces
quite there, but the sense of place that you would have. I mean, I look at Jabba's ship and I think, man, if that were really done up as if it had been really this sort of pleasure ship, it would be amazing. Or a lot of the levels that feel distinctly Empire to really pay off on what it feels like to be in an Empire space could be really, really cool. So yeah, I totally agree. It would be interesting to see, and could not hurt EA's fortunes, I bet. But anyway, we've gone almost an hour. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk some pillars, and then we had a few questions from Twitter. Sounds
good? Yep.
Okay. Welcome back from the break. As often we do, or always I suppose we do at the end of a series, we like to look back and talk sort of about the pillars of the games we've played, which are either the sorts of things that we think informed the game's design or maybe would inform our own practice going forward, but are definitely sort of the big takeaways we have from a game of what works, occasionally what didn't, but mostly just what works. I guess I'll throw over to you since you've got a bevy of them. Which are probably all just like 1, use Star Wars, 2, use Star Wars, 3. I'll give you some room, whatever 3 is. But no, go ahead.
I think in this case for our takeaways and pillars, if you've been listening to the series so far for the 3 episodes, we've done pretty big deep dives into these topics, so I don't think we need to talk too much more deeply about them. But obviously, the first one that you can guess for me is level design, and I just think it's a very interesting high water mark without maybe realizing that it was at the time for the team. I don't know, but maybe we'll get to. Wouldn't be podcast without June. Barking up there.
There's our Ewoks.
Yeah, she has an opinion about level design. I just think that it's an unexpected gem of level design goals and sort of ethos. Like I said earlier, just sort of like whether that was intentional or not, they happened upon a different way of thinking about, for me at least. And again, maybe we can do some due diligence and research at some point about like what around it we're kind of pushing on the boundaries of the same topic. I just don't remember much going as far as this one did, because it really stepped into a new realm, and I think it pushed the rest of the industry to think differently about that. And it really, like, the shooters of the time were so focused on combat for the most part. Level design is obviously very important in the id games and stuff, and I'm not saying the level design there isn't good. It just had different goals. And here, you can clear a room from a combat perspective or a series of rooms, and then just kind of be and I don't mean necessarily just getting lost and trying to find your way, but just trying to figure out a puzzle, or the level itself has these big moving parts and puzzles, and they were just stretching the engine, like we said before break, the scripting and the way that the logic worked, and just made these really fully realized levels and spaces that put me into the fantasy in a really big way. And it made a big impact on me as a player. And as I said multiple times over the last few episodes, it had a big impact on me joining the industry, or wanting to, at least, right? I didn't know that I would or that I could, but it definitely, was like, wow, this is something special. So, and I think the level design was the tip of that spear. So,
yeah, no, I mean, no argument. I commented, I think a couple episodes ago, that I thought the level design really is the MVP of this game. I think it really stands out. I mean, I will say that sort of one of my pillars, at least, is that it's okay to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary, as long as you have a strong story or wish fulfillment hook. And I think this has both of those, right? Yeah. It has a pretty strong story backbone. We've talked about sort of some of the ways that that's hard to do well in games, but fundamentally, I feel like, it's got the constant propulsion of like, I definitely need to go do this thing next, because that's going to take me next in my step towards, I don't know, blowing up something, right? There's a big ultimate MacGuffin, and basically the structure of the game is a lot of smaller MacGuffins, and that's totally fine. I mean, that's a perfectly serviceable hook. It's more of a hook than you get in other first-person shooters of the time, and really not until Half-Life, some years later, 5 years later, I guess, that you get something more involved. So I will say, I think that this has it has small innovations in the tech. That you have the sort of pan up and down, which is new, but it doesn't really
jumping, crouching,
right? Yeah, I mean, there's basically some camera tricks. Fundamentally, is what you're talking about with it. The jumping, I guess, is more than that. But even Ultima Underworld had the jumping.
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't know if it had the crouching, but I don't remember. I feel like it must have. It even had the pitching up and down. So. even those are not sort of like a huge, there's no like huge, this is different than any other game that came before. So there's no one part of that really sort of stands out technically. But you're sort of, this is a first person shooter from LucasArts, and it comes out and stands toe to toe with other games, largely because it executes fine on the tech. It's not mind blowing, but it's fine. And then it just elevates it with all its ancillary bits, the story, the sort of propulsion of how that story is told, and just a sort of general wish fulfillment with lots of specific elements drawn from the films, even if they're just parallels. Is really nice. I think that works extremely well and really elevates it in a way that I think, I mean, we've talked a lot about how good the level design is. If it's not motivated by it being an Imperial whatever, I think the level design doesn't necessarily stand on its own without that. Yeah. And I don't think the story stands on its own without the Star Wars, certainly. So there's just like these three sort of pieces that make sort of a little stool together that I think, or a tripod or whatever, that holds the whole thing up pretty well. And then everything else is at least serviceable, and certainly the tech is. So, yeah, I think that for me is a big part of it. Yeah, and I think it gave a good marketing hook at the time too, which even if they would have never said it this way as marketing, but it was basically Doom but Star Wars, right? But it's more than that. It's the tech's at least as good as Doom's. The level design is probably better than Doom's in terms of being motivated towards the spaces and the environment, the world, the Star Wars stuff. And then you've got a decent story, an actual story, even if it is kind of fairly linear, with one reversal. So it's nice. It's a good story. And you don't have to crazy innovate in any one area as long as all of those deliver pretty well. So yeah, and you hit on, so I had two kind of larger pillars and then one smaller one, but you hit on my other two a little bit there, but just to kind of reinforce them, to your point about like the innovation or evolution versus revolution, the smaller of the three pillars that I was going to mention is kind of I guess what I'd call secondary mechanics / systems that they iteratively added on to the Doom model as a clone. And what I mean by that is sort of the gadgets, the inventory, the mission briefings, the shield system and the health system, the battery system, all those little things that were just this little additive thing that was like not the ice cleats.
Not the ice cleats, no, but they tried,
No, that's fine.
Not the best idea, but
you try.
But just this kind of again, it wraps back into the Star Wars side of it, but just gadgetry, and this little extra layer of secondary mechanics that the other shooters at the time didn't have. But like you said, like it's all about iterating on the golden model, which at the time would have been Doom, and you slap some Star Wars on there, like you said, and then the other side of my second bigger pillar was just about the full commitment to the fantasy fulfillment, and really taking. You can just imagine the brainstorm meetings or what have you, right? Where you just every level is about, okay, this is our detention center level, and this is our Super Star Destroyer level, and this is our Jabba level, and they're all slightly different than the movies, but it's just similar enough to where you're like, oh yeah, I'm in it. I'm in the world. Story's definitely fine. But I just think that delivering on that, which we talked a lot about throughout the series, delivering on that was really obviously a big goal and focus. And I think they did a great job at that for its genre and for the time. Again, don't forget the time of, what the state of Star Wars at this time was. There wasn't much Star Wars out there, really video games and some comics and, not even that many novels around this time. And so people were hungry for it, and it was just kind of coming at maybe the right time too. So, I
actually wanted to point out one other sort of small thing for me, and I sort of alluded to it in the very first episode, which is it has one of my legitimately top 5 moments in games of all time, which is the introduction of that first Terminator looking Dark Trooper, and how terrifying to me that was, in the mines, I guess it is. That was just a moment of, and I was playing on a hard difficulty level then and all that stuff, but it was a moment of genuine terror, of just, oh my God, and it won't stop, and it can't, and it's going to get me, right? I mean, it was, and it's supported by everything. The audio that supports it is terrific. The setting that supports it is terrific. I mean, you feel like you've descended into hell, and now you've found what hell is sending after you, right?
Yeah.
It all just perfectly supports that moment of discovery there at the end. You were going to say?
I was going to say there are no other enemies in that bottom section, right? Once you get down there, there's a bit of a quiet calm there before you place the charges. You're like, oh, I'm here. I'm placing the charges. This was easy, you know? Right. And then the other thing I forgot to mention when we talked about the mines in the first episode, melee hits go through your shields. And and the phase 1 only does the melee.
The melee, right? So like the Dino. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, woof. Like, you go down.
Don't let it get close.
Yeah, so it's really,
and I mean, that's another place where the level design works really well with the enemy design.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because as I pointed out, you've got those sort of circles, and it's really hard to know where it's going to come from, and it might come up from behind you. Because of course, we only had stereo audio at the time, and at best, right? A lot of systems probably even mono, and so you just know it's getting louder, so it's getting closer. And it might be coming up behind you, because you had those sort of circular things, and you're trying to figure out which way it's going to come from. And although it didn't pay off quite as well this time when I playing it, I could remember perfectly. I mean, to the second how it played out for me the first time. And that is a moment I will treasure forever, because it just legitimately one of the biggest payoffs for me ever, playing a game. And I mean, we've been playing classic upon classic. I don't think I've ever said this on the podcast of just like, oh, I remember this specific moment as being one of my favorites of all time. And so it definitely makes that list for me. Oh, that's not true. Maybe Final Fantasy IX. I love the ending of that game. So that's another one for me. But yeah, that is for me a thing that I can't really say it's a takeaway, but if you can deliver that kind of impact on a player, that's a takeaway in and of itself. So.
Yeah, absolutely. One honorable mention that we talked a little bit about in the break was just the music. Can't be, I think, overstated enough. I think the interesting thing about the music that we talked about, I think in the first episode, for me specifically, because I played this game so much, I had just ingrained in my head that I thought that it was actually, that these were actual tracks from the films, that I just didn't remember playing out this way. But it was actually Clint Bajakian, actually reimagining Williams-esque music for the tracks for the game, other than the main themes, and just doing a stellar job at being Star Wars and being Williams, but being original at the same time. So I think a shout out to that too. He's an amazing composer.
Yeah, no argument here. I mean, when you said that, you didn't know which were the Williams tracks and which were the Bajakian tracks when you originally played the game, and how you were like, I thought that was in the movies, and it turned out not to be. It was definitely pretty interesting. I don't remember that specifically for me, but I can totally believe it. Especially, I listened to a lot of the tracks and pick which ones I'm going to use for the interstitials for the podcast or the introduction. And there's a lot of good tracks, and they're long. There's a lot of diversity in them as well. Yeah. Which is not a thing we've really talked about, but is a real problem in games, especially at the time when you didn't have tons of. This may have originally shipped on CD, so it may have been less of an issue. But at the time, coming up with music that you could repeat and wouldn't get repetitive, if you know what I mean, was a really difficult thing. And this is music that feels feels like it fits pretty well. So yeah, definitely an interesting honorable mention there. All right, well, I will just sort of end this here to say we're going to talk to somebody this weekend, so we should have an interview for you next week. So we're not going to announce a next game yet, which is good because we don't know what it is. So that works out well.
Oh, that old chestnut.
Oh, that old. Anyway, but we'll figure that out. In the meantime, normally we like to have email at devgameclub@gmail.com. I actually reached out to our Twitter audience at devgameclub to say, oh, hey, we're recording tonight. Do you have any questions for us? And I got a few, all from at Not My Views. And maybe we'll just tackle these one at a time. They're all in sort of, under 280 characters. The first one is, how do you think the various Star Wars franchise games have dealt with the dichotomy of Jedis being incredibly rare in the universe versus the obvious potential for wish fulfillment? Galaxies and the Old Republic versus TIE Fighter, Dark Forces 2, and Jedi Knight 2, for example. You're probably a bigger Star Wars game fanatic than I am. But I mean, that whole question of Jedis are supposed to be rare. There's at least after, I guess, episode 3, right? That's where he kills all the Jedis.
Yeah.
Versus, I mean, basically,
they're even rare then, but yeah. Before.
Right. There's not many, but then there's only Luke. And Obi-Wan and Yoda, I guess, after that, right? So they're unusual. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, how long do we have? Because I could go pretty deep on this one. But
actually, you know what? I'm going to tackle this in this way. So he mentions Galaxies versus the Old Republic. So in 2002, I'll say, I'm not sure when exactly it was, but I think it was around 2002. The people who were going to make Galaxies came to LucasArts to pitch their technical and design vision for Galaxies. And they told us each server is only going to have 2 Jedi. Maybe even 1 Jedi. I don't remember what the pitch was. It was not just us, but it was also licensing who were in the room. Licensing loved it. Yeah. All the people who actually played video games were like, that is the worst idea I've ever heard. Because what you want to do when you play these games is have the fantasy of, I'm my hero, whoever my hero is. It might be Luke, it might be Leia. Thankfully, maybe games are going to finally explore what it'd be like to be Leia, or Kylo, or what's her name? Ray? Something Ray. Yeah, Ray. Yeah. Sorry, I don't think Star Wars.
I don't think Ray has a surname that we know of.
Okay, so just Ray.
I could be wrong.
That's why I can't remember. Kylo Ray, right? That's no. Anyway, whoever, that you would have this opportunity to role plays any of these characters that you might like playing. And one of the things they did, I guess, in the extended universe was have sort of force sensitive characters to basically allow for the idea that people would kind of have an understanding of how to use the force. And they should have just leaned into that and said, you know what, if you can do that, then you can get different powers and you'll have these different skill trees and all those things. And maybe you can't be a full-on Jedi Knight without doing a bunch of quests that are that. They could have done that in such a way.
Well, that's what they ended up doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is that when it came out and there was only 1 Jedi per server and you didn't know who I was going to be, everybody hated it. And I feel like they learned their lesson. And I feel like since then, Star Wars games have been okay with, you know what, let's just give the people what they want. And I think it's okay. You know what? It's super rare, but here we are in this sort of weird splinter of the universe where maybe there's a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's fine. So.
Yeah, I think ultimately the short answer is really to Brett's point. Though canon and franchise kind of management is super important to something like Star Wars, any franchise like that, they're typically Well, I think ultimately the answer is there needs to be sort of each game needs to have its own internal logic for why it's doing what it's doing. And that can include gaminess and fantasy fulfillment for that. And that's what Galaxies ended up doing, bending the rules some. The one thing I will applaud them for at least attempting, even though I also felt like it was a crazy idea when I was in those pitch meetings, along with Brett, is this sense of rarity because one of the things that MMOs were doing at the time in those early days, whether it be EverQuest or, EverQuest was basically eating UO's lunch, Ultima Online's lunch. And these were the Ultima Online folks, right? Sony Online that were going to be doing Galaxies. And so they were bringing that lineage. This is Raf Koster and those folks. And so there were these legendary figures in EverQuest, right? And in UO of these players who had gotten to these sort of mythological heights, and they became these sort of, it was the early days of the internet, where early enough to where a player was starting to have its own persona, because of the heroic feats and really the time they were putting into these games. Whether it be raids, the first guild to down a dragon in EverQuest, became this crazy story that just spread like wildfire. So with their Jedi mentality of that design, they were trying to basically engineer that, right? Of like, who is it going to be? And then you get the special title, and then, it kind of spreads in a viral way. And the theory behind it was quite interesting, but we just knew from working on Star Wars games ourselves is that's really not the point.
That's not what people want.
No,
I mean, my and you point that out, and playing D&D again recently, I think yeah, sure. I mean, the original D&D had a lot of spells which were like Mordenkainen's this and Tenser's that, and those were characters who were named from like Gygax's campaigns that he did with his buddies, and those were the heroes that were in the original Greyhawk setting 30 years ago, or whatever it is now, 40 years ago. But that stuff has to happen organically. And when people are coming to your property with some sort of wish that they want to fulfill, you can't try to engineer them, because everybody wants to come and have that wish, or some large percentage of the people who want to play your thing want to have that wish fulfilled. So you need to give opportunities for different sorts of those viral kind of things to happen.
Yeah.
You can't plan for them. I mean, when somebody cornered the market on a WoW store, what are they called in WoW? They're just called the store, right? The market.
What, the auction house?
The auction house, right.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, when things like that happen, it's amazing. And a couple of characters do this thing that you wouldn't believe could actually be done. Yeah. And that's a cool thing that you definitely wouldn't want to build your game around. It's not the cool thing of, I want to go and do this thing that I see in the movies that I'm basing my game on, right? I mean, it's a totally different systemic sort of thing that happens.
Yeah.
So
why? Yeah. It's a tricky one. I mean, obviously for any fan who's listening to this, they probably already are thinking about this, but Knights of the Old Republic, or both Knights of the Old Republic, as well as the MMO, SWTOR.
The Old Republic, right?
Yeah, the Old Republic.
SWTOR.
Star Wars. They have, and I don't know, potentially this is why they chose that setting, but they have, canonically, or at that point it was extended fiction, but now kind of part of the Legends thing or whatever the Disney calls it. But they had a kind of a, get out of jail free card, because at that era there were thousands of Jedis running around. So it actually made sense, because that's what the history said. So, and I don't remember the particulars of that. We definitely know some of the people that started on that, kicked that project off with BioWare, but that probably was actually the reason they chose that setting, is it gave them free reign to do whatever they wanted to, because it was, I think, 10,000 years before.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Before the prequels. So it's
that's a good decision to make when you're looking I think whenever you take something that's a big fan thing with lots of wish fulfillment potential in it, you want to find a setting within it that allows for that to happen, whatever those wishes are, especially with something that needs to do well, like something expensive like an MMO. So yeah, I mean, I think
if you can, that's the goal. You got to try to find the right balance.
You got to find the space, right? I mean, you're not going to make a Tomb Raider MMO, so you never have the problem of how are all these Lara Crofts going to exist. You're never going to have that, right? But when you're looking at Star Wars, and it's like, well, we want to have this space where we can. I mean, really, whenever you're making an MMO, you want to really think about, okay, what are we going to choose that we can allow for lots of different sorts of fantasies to be fulfilled in, because those things are so expensive. And then when it comes to single player games, you really need to think about, well, what is the fantasy we're trying to tackle, and can we deliver on that for enough people to support the development of the game? So that's really what that comes down to. I think we'll take just one other one, because we could probably spend a significant amount of time on all the 3 or 4 questions we got here. But this is same thing. How do you think Dark Forces stands up against the other standout first-person shooters of the period? Rise of the Triad, Doom, and Duke Nukem 3D. Was the Star Wars franchise a leg up for the story aspect, which Dark Forces appears to be stronger in? I mean, I think that's a fairly quick answer for me. I mean, I think yes, it was a leg up. How does it stand up? What do you think?
Yeah, I think I've talked about this semi-recently, or maybe multiple times on the podcast. And not to kind of be overly academic about it, but my favorite games, and I think the games that stand out and stand the test of time, separate from whether they were the innovator or the first innovator in their area. So for instance, Doom is significant and still holds up probably, and is fun enough to play. But it has its crown because of its and Wolfenstein as well, because of the initial steps that it took for the medium. For me, though, the games that made the biggest impact, and I think that stand the test of time and still hold up and can stand up against any of these games, are the ones where the balance of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics are more equally balanced, I guess I would say, in the MDA kind of school of thought. And I feel like for Dark Forces, for me, I think that balance is greater because all 3 of those things have enough attention given to it. So there's not necessarily any big innovation, as you said earlier, but because that balance is there, and I think this is something Blizzard does really well. They're never really completely innovating in any area, but they make the game so cohesively sound in all areas that I just think they become much more polished games. So I think they stand up. I think Dark Forces still holds up and stands up quite well against those. And using Duke as an example, another game that I love playing, but on the aesthetic side, it never hit for me because it's just the character's not likable. It's just such a weird, setup. Mechanically very fun. Level design I remember being quite good. Enemy design was quite good, but to your analogy,
but the environment is not terrific. Yeah,
and it's just like kind of boring, and like uninspired, and very like one note. But to your point about like the 3-legged stool or what have you, I feel like Dark Forces hits all of those legs quite well, for me at least.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think that I personally think Doom stands up pretty well. It is the first. It also, I think, is stronger than any of the others in terms of enemy design. It really sort of, of course, it also is such a pioneer. But I feel like the enemy design is fantastic, and the balance between the different sorts of enemies and the variety you get from putting them together is pretty great. There's not really another equivalent that.
Yeah, that's fair. Dark Forces doesn't really shine in that regard.
Right. Dark Forces doesn't stand up in that way. And I do think the level design, while much more abstract, is also equally fun, although kind of on different aesthetic measures, right? It's not meant to be a sort of real space like the Star Wars one is, or even Rise of the Triad to that extent, or even Duke. Doom is really meant to be, these are not spaces that are sort of meant to be analogous to anything real, so it's okay that they are sort of they look really cool sort of as an arcade layout, and you're like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. You've seen those sort of 2D maps. So I think that's fine. So I think actually of those sort of the four kind of mentioned, Doom is probably the other one that I would put up against Dark Forces, but I do think they're actually, of those four, the two best. I've played Doom and Doom 2 multiple times, and I've played Dark Forces multiple times. I'd be hard pressed to pick one or the other, but I do think Doom really holds up, even if I know it's not sort of to your aesthetic, Tim, but it's I do love it. So,
yep.
All right. Well, we will put a pin in it there, I think, with Dark Forces. Like I said, we're going to have an interview this weekend that we're recording and put out to you next week. In the meantime, you can find all, 116 episodes and our show notes at devgameclub.com. We love to read your reviews, particularly those 5-star reviews, which I think is the only reviews Apple Podcasts accepts anymore. So just keep that in mind when you're plugging that number in. But that helps us reach new listeners and keep the podcast going and, finding a new audience and more people to share our insights with. Of course, you can find the podcast at DevGameClub on Twitter. I'm at Brett_Douville, and he's
at Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
Whenever we're playing games, I like to stream them at twitch.tv/Brett Douville, no underscore. If you follow me or the podcast Twitter feed, you'll find that there. But for now, I think I will say good night.
Good night.